Good evening, everyone. I'm happy you could join us tonight. I'm Marci Reaven, New York Historical's Vice President for History Exhibitions, and I'm joined tonight by Dominique Jean-Louis, my wonderful colleague and New York Historical's project historian. We're pleased to welcome you to Curator Confidential, a live virtual program presented each Tuesday evening exclusively for members and other supporters while our museum remains closed to the public. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to say thank you to all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. So tonight, Dominique and I would like to share with you some highlights from our exhibit, Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow. We began this project in 2017 when our trustee, the historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., suggested to museum president Louise Mir that we mount an exhibit about the Reconstruction era that followed the Civil War. Professor Gates was then working on his own PBS series about Reconstruction, so it seemed the two projects could amplify each other. And importantly, the 150th anniversary of the passage of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was just about to happen the following year. One of our first curatorial decisions was to focus on the theme of citizenship, which was not only a key historical issue, but also a topic that animates many of the programs that New York Historical has been doing. Then, within weeks of starting up, the deadly Unite the Right white supremacist rally took place in Charlottesville. And that, of course, only reinforced our sense that this was the right time to be telling this story. So Dominique will lead a tour of the exhibit, but first I want to let you know that the program will last approximately 45 minutes. That includes 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. You can submit your questions via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. We've disabled the chat function, so please make sure to use the Q&A. And then after the presentation, we'll get to as many questions as time allows. So Dominique, I turn it over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be able to share with you this evening a little bit more about both the history behind Black citizenship in the age of Jim Crow, but also some of our curatorial decision-making processes, our favorite items, the stories that we were so excited to be able to tell to our visitors, and then, of course, to you this evening as well. So to get started right in the midst of this theme of citizenship that Marci pointed out, we of course begin with one of the treasures of our collection, this portrait of Dred Scott. Now we don't know the artist, but it is in our collection, and it's a crucial starting point for understanding how the United States' journey towards having Black Americans join us as citizens was really one that took a variety of forms, was really one that was not a guaranteed conclusion. So Dred Scott, of course, is an enslaved man who petitions for his right to freedom. And that petition, that legal petition within the court system, travels through the circuit and state courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1857, Roger Taney rules that not only was Dred Scott's plea to be included as a citizen, to be considered as a citizen of the United States, not only was that going to be denied, but in fact, no Black person could ever be a citizen of the United States. So that was the state of affairs in 1857, and it's an important starting point for our journey and for our exhibition to think about this, this process by which African Americans receive full citizenship, because the starting point is so dire. This is, of course, in the lead up to the Civil War, this national question of what's going to happen to slavery, what's going to happen to the 4 million individuals who are enslaved in the United States in this time period. So we begin our journey of understanding the pathway to Black citizenship at this low moment when Black citizenship was to be forever denied, according to the highest court in the land. And of course, this decision struck a huge blow to those Americans who felt deeply that the promise of America should be extended to its African American constituents, and that they should be given full citizenship and the vote, and therefore kind of is a catalyst for the events that lead up to the Civil War. Now, the Civil War itself is obviously such an incredibly important and fundamental moment in American history, and we were able to try to convey some of that importance to this topic of Black citizenship via this painting, a triptych painting by Thomas Waterman Wood, kindly loaned to us by the Metropolitan Museum. What this particular triptych does is it has these three panels. We have the contraband, the volunteer, the veteran, this pathway of this individual from being enslaved to being a veteran of the war, to being a hero. And this is an important document for the time period for a few reasons. One of which, it's actually a rare example of a Civil War painting that was popular in its time. Even in the 1860s, when this was painted, it exhibited widely. People were really excited to see it, in part because it gives us this idea of not only an African-American man's pathway through the Civil War, but also this idea of earning citizenship, right? That not only should African-Americans be considered full citizens of the United States because you know, they are born here, they are Americans the same way everyone else is American, but really they have made particular kinds of sacrifices to establish America, to nurture it into what it became. And so this idea of earning citizenship, of being even more worthy of voting rights and all the other rights that come with citizenship, this painting gets at some of that, and also the hopefulness that African Americans felt that in the aftermath of the war, they would be included, that their contributions would be recognized, and that they would be welcomed into the American family. So of course we know that the North wins the war, slavery is ended, and one of the most important documents of that time period is of course the 13th Amendment, signed in 1865 by President Abraham Lincoln very shortly before he was assassinated. Indicated here that he actually signed the resolution that passes the 13th Amendment, which is curious because presidents don't have to sign constitutional amendments. That's not really part of the process, but he chose to add his name. He wanted this to be part of his legacy, part of what his presidency represented, which is that he brought about this end of slavery, this long fought for by generations of abolitionists, this long fought for victory that says that Americans cannot be enslaved, Black Americans cannot be enslaved. That's not what this country stands for. It's also the first time that the word slavery is used in the Constitution in all of its descriptions of, you know, liberty and equality. It's the 13th Amendment is actually the first time that slavery is addressed by name. And so, of course, Lincoln is assassinated in 1865, and his Democratic vice president, Andrew Johnson, is at the helm. And in the exhibition, it was really important for us to take our visitors through the process of Reconstruction. We were very aware as we were putting together the exhibition that this isn't a topic that's often covered in schools. It's a topic that's very often misunderstood in terms of its historical meaning. And so it became crucial for us to really take our visitors through what it meant, what it didn't mean. So Reconstruction is the process of bringing the South back into the Union after the dissolution of the Confederacy, and creating a pathway for full citizenship for those African Americans who were enslaved before the Civil War. And as you can see here, we chose to do that via this great design process where we kind of brought alive some of the political cartoons of the time period to really highlight both the difficulty and the debates that surrounded Reconstruction and the passage of these amendments, and also how unpopular Andrew Johnson was. Many of you will know that he was the first president to be impeached. His impeachment did not result in him being removed from office, but his views that there should be leniency on former Confederates, that you know, we should be very cautious and slow in extending citizenship rights to African Americans, those weren't shared by many members of Congress, some of who, like Charles Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens, had been long involved in the process of trying to attain abolition for African Americans. Many of you will be familiar with our trustee Eric Foner's latest book, The Second Founding, that looks at this Reconstruction moment as the second founding of America, and both in Congress and also on the ground, just socially for Americans at the time. This moment was seen as such an opening of possibility for our country. Who could be welcomed in? What we really stood for. How a democracy could function with an opening up of who was included. And so this idea of a second founding opened up so much immense potential that people who were in Congress really felt that as much as possible needed to be pushed through, because who was to say how long this moment would last. And so through their efforts of kind of pushing through Johnson's opposition, of trying to get Reconstruction settled and full Black citizenship attained, we of course have the Reconstruction Amendments. You've just seen one, the 13th Amendment. We also have the 14th, as Marci mentioned. The anniversary of the 14th Amendment just occurred in 2018, the sesquicentennial. But of course, the 14th Amendment guarantees that all persons born in the United States are citizens, full citizens, which is a pretty radical departure from the time period before, and certainly from our Supreme Court decision with Dred Scott. And so this is such a hallmark of the Reconstruction time period, this amendment that's gone on to be the justification for so many civil rights cases, you know, civil all the way up to the Supreme Court, this idea that there's equality under the law, that all persons born here are citizens of the United States, and that if you're naturalized, you reserve those same rights as well. Of course, then that is followed up by the 15th Amendment, which is kind of finished up in 1870, which guarantees the right to vote for the formerly enslaved. Of course, at the time, that would have only meant Black men. However, it's again a drastic departure from the time period before, where you really have this opening up of potential, this opening up of democracy to those millions of men and women who had been enslaved prior to the Civil War and prior to the passage of these amendments. Now, we wanted to make sure that as we were discussing citizenship, that we weren't just talking about the code of law, right? Naming this exhibition Black Citizenship in the Age of Jim Crow, we knew that citizenship means so much more than what, you know, political rights you do or don't have. It's a feeling. It's a feeling of belonging. It's a feeling of being secure. It's a guarantee of equality. And so we devoted a section of the exhibition, we termed it Priorities of Freedom, to express how African Americans seized that citizenship for themselves. And so we included historical artifacts like this information wanted ads. These were ads taken out by African Americans in the time period following the Civil War, during Reconstruction, to try to reconnect with their families. That was the #1 priority of all of these people. Again, millions of people, so many families were torn apart through sale, through exchange, through people being ripped from their families and their plantations. They now wanted to reunite. And so you of course have these ads springing up all over the country, and that sense of wanting to bring families together is a huge motivating factor for so many of these families, even before, you know, finding a job, even before changing your name, any of these other things. It's, I miss my family and I want to see them again. In addition to that, being able to claim your family for yourself. So we have this terrific marriage certificate from 1874. Of course, marriage existed among enslaved people before the end of the Civil War, but it wasn't recognized. You had these kind of you know, unofficial marriages. You might have heard the term jumping the broom. You know, they were ceremonial, but they weren't inscribed in the law. And so now families could make that official. And you saw thousands upon thousands of African Americans taking that initiative to make their marriages, to make their families recognized by the law, and receive these marriage certificates. Now, one of the other major priorities of these African American families, once they had these rights, once slavery had ended, is really education, is literacy. We have this terrific photo from our library collection of families, standing outside of their homes and reading. Sources describe African-American communities as being obsessed with reading and literacy at this time, the young teaching the old and the old teaching the young. As we know, during slavery, it was illegal to teach many enslaved people how to read, knowing that the power that held, to be able to read, to be able to expose yourself to new ideas, and to do that critical analysis, that was seen as so dangerous to the institution of slavery that it was kept from enslaved people. And so after slavery ends, one of the first things they want to do is be able to read for themselves, read the Bible for themselves, go to school. And so you have this will amongst enslaved people to teach one another how to obtain this vital skill that was kept from them for so long. Now, you might have heard the term carpetbaggers. This often refers to people from the North, white people from the North, who came down South to kind of try to establish this new society in the aftermath of slavery. That was kind of a derogatory word at the time, but it is very true that many white Northerners did come down to the South in order to help establish the society that was a little bit more equal, that was a little bit more open, that had more opportunity. And so what we're looking at now is this photo of the Penn School, which was established on the Sea Islands in the South, where many of them women, but people from the North were coming down in order to establish these schools and teach African-American communities and children, as we see here, how to read. And the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina are such an important place in terms of establishing these new ideas of freedom. There was the Penn School, there were agricultural schools, there were all of these mechanisms put in place on those islands to try to establish African-American communities that, again, had more opportunity and also had the skills to be able to be self-sufficient. Now, of course, with the 15th Amendment, you also have the right to vote, and alongside it, the right to run for office. And so you see this explosion of African-American elected officials. You have, of course, Hiram Revels, who you can see over here on my right. The first man to serve, the first African-American man to serve in Congress. He serves in the House from 1870 to 1871. And we can see a number of his colleagues in the engraving to the left. This idea of Black leadership was so dangerous at the time. People could not believe that we would have these representatives who could effectively serve in the government, that they would be educated enough and exhibit the skills needed to lead. But it certainly was the case, from the halls of Congress right on down to local postmaster and sheriff. Thousands of African-American men held positions in elected office during Reconstruction. Just those short years, it really shows the capacity for leadership that was just sitting there, that wasn't able to express itself before the end of slavery, but with the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, and certainly with the ability for African-American men to vote across the country, you now have this ability for elected officials in Congress to really represent the communities they come from, both in experience, both in background, to really be able to lend that voice in the highest, legislative bodies in the land in a way that had certainly never occurred before. And I should mention that one of the ways that we organized this section was thinking of the inspirational words of some of our founding documents: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equality, democracy. And we organized these objects and photos into those sections: life, liberty, happiness, to try to convey the way that African-Americans were seizing those citizenship rights for themselves, in addition to exercising the rights that the Reconstruction Amendments gave to them. So we also have a new relationship to the land. Of course, African-Americans before, had been forced against their will to pick cotton, the cash crop of the South. And it's remarkable how in those Sea Islands that I mentioned, when African-Americans were given control to farm for themselves, to be able to use the land for what they wanted, the first thing they grew were subsistence crops, sweet potatoes and okra and peppers and greens, because it was more important for them to be able to provide for their families than it was to make money. They really wanted, for them, citizenship meant a certain kind of independence, a certain kind of self-sufficiency that, as we'll see, the advent of sharecropping in the years to come, where African Americans could not grow their own crops, were forced to grow these cash crops and receive a portion of the profit, that directly countered what they really wanted to do, which was to maintain these subsistence farms directly following their emancipation. So I mentioned that with the advent of Black office holders, that was a very dangerous idea. So dangerous, in fact, that it brought about the beginning of, my apologies, this is doorbell. It brought about the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan, which we have a photo here from 1868. So sorry, of a Klansman on horseback. And you might be surprised at the image you're seeing. A lot of us associate the Ku Klux Klan with those, pointed white hats and the long white robes. But in the earliest iterations of the Klan that were founded during Reconstruction, it looked very different. It was less organized. It was a lot more of these local vigilante groups who took as their goal, took as their function to really limit Black voting and Black office holding. So if someone was audacious enough to try to run for office, they would often be faced with an individual like this, so sorry, who would be on horseback or just coming to your home, threatening your family, in a bid to try to end this participation in democracy, Black office holding, Black voting. And so in order to convey that, we actually had a facsimile made of one of these Klan robes, and we're able to share that in the exhibition. And something that is so fascinating that came to us as we were commissioning the work for someone to make a facsimile for us is that these were objects that were handmade. During Reconstruction, they would have been made by wives and sisters, by mothers, that really brought home the way that curtailing Black political power was the job of a whole family. And so with all of this political ill will comes the end of Reconstruction during the compromise election of 1877. We have this compromise that arises from it, where Republicans are given the presidency, but the Democrats in the South will essentially be left alone. This kind of gentleman's bargain or gentleman's handshake agreement that really leaves African Americans in the South, especially, without the kinds of protections that the initial iteration of Reconstruction really provided. And so in our next section of the exhibition, what we tried to do is explain the rise of Jim Crow that took place after Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877. And it was very important for us to be able to tell that story in a very regional way, that although we associate the worst of the Jim Crow violence and discrimination with the African American South, that it's really a nationwide affair. And so you have Jim Crow himself. The figure of Jim Crow was actually a minstrel character that arose right here in New York City in theaters down on the Bowery. Where a performer named Thomas Daddy Rice created this minstrel, buffoonish figure depicting an African American man in order to kind of poke fun at African Americans, and it was a hit. You couldn't get a ticket. The theaters were packed with people wanting to see this incredibly demeaning depiction of African Americans as bumbling, as inept. And this idea of stereotypes, that Black people being especially less than, being not as deserving of full humanity and full citizenship, this idea of propaganda and stereotypes arises in the North and really spreads throughout the country. New York is the kind of marketing capital of the country. And as it spreads around the country, it has devastating effects for African Americans' ability to be seen as deserving of and deserving of full equality and as equal citizens. But of course, we do face incredibly different circumstances in the South, especially given the need. For hundreds of years, the South has had this kind of uncompensated labor, and they wanted to bring that back. And so you had things like the convict labor leasing system, whereby if an African-American man was, or any African-American were convicted of a crime, they could be forced into servitude under the 13th Amendment. And that labor was used to build railroads, as we're seeing, for mining operations. That labor was subcontracted out, which has devastating effects on Black life. These conditions were often really horrific. And so you really see that resurgence of violence and violent uncompensated labor towards African Americans. I mentioned the stereotypes of Jim Crow, which again originate in the North. We have objects like this in our collection, a kind of demeaning depiction of, it's a bank, but it displays a demeaning depiction of an African American. And as I mentioned, this has incredible effects on Black political power. As these stereotypes emerge that show African Americans as inept, as incapable of being governed, you see that really start to bolster voter suppression. And so we have cases like in Mississippi. During Reconstruction, more than 90% of eligible Black men who could vote were participating in elections. And through this voter suppression that started to roll in during after the end of Reconstruction, whether that's the grandfather clause, whether that was literacy tests, all these mechanisms that were used against African Americans to curtail their ability to vote, they were so effective that in Mississippi by 1892, less than 6% or fewer than 6% of eligible Black men were voting in elections because those voter suppression tactics were so effective. And so by the 1890s, you really have this situation where you have a second degree of citizenship. You have second-class citizenship, which is inscribed in the law, drawing to mind our 1857 Dred Scott case. By 1896, we have, of course, Plessy v. Ferguson, where this kind of segregation, which we're seeing in front of us, these colored and white bus signs that are actually in our collection, that this is perfectly legal, right? The Supreme Court rules in that landmark case that if it's separate, that separate was fine if it was equal, which of course it never could be. But this ability to inscribe within the law a legal justification for segregation marked forevermore, are marked from then on, this complete justification for African Americans to receive second-class citizenship, second-class treatment in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society. It really ushers in this, this period, which is often referred to as the nadir of race relations, the lowest point in American history of relations between the races. So not only do you have that happening at the level of the courts, but we wanted to have another section of the exhibition that really looks at how Jim Crow functions. Once Reconstruction comes to an end and you have the suppression of the Black vote, you have this dissemination of stereotypes, what was that used to do? And we have in front of us here the case study of Confederate memorials. So most Confederate memorials don't go up directly following the Civil War. They actually are going up in the early 20th century, and we had a number of them made to scale here in the exhibition, as you can see in front of you. These are from Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, and we just get a sense of the massiveness of that scale. This is all involved in a kind of ideology called the Lost Cause, which is an attempt to spread the message that the Civil War was, a good idea, or the Confederacy was a good idea and just unfortunately lost the Civil War, that the cause was just, the cause was a noble one. And by filling Southern cities with monuments to Confederates, by filling textbooks with stories of noble Confederate soldiers, there was this sense that the Civil War was a waste, right? That it shouldn't have happened, that African Americans weren't ready for citizenship, and that the country was worse off. And so that's one incredibly dark time period during Jim Crow and after the Civil War, where that narrative is being retold. And so we devoted, and we can see here at the unveiling of these kinds of monuments, how incredibly popular this idea was. We have thousands of people who are attending the unveiling of these monuments. But we actually dedicated the majority of this section to African-American stories of fighting back. So whether that's the Silent Parade in 1917, one of the first parades of its kind, completely silent, thousands of African-Americans walking down Fifth Avenue right here in New York, protesting racial violence, asking to be considered as full and equal citizens. You have this sense of the NAACP, which is founded here in New York at around the same time period, really pushing back against the encroaching, demeaning laws and procedures of Jim Crow. Now, it wasn't just big organizations that are fighting back against Jim Crow. You also have individuals taking it upon themselves to fight back in smaller ways, in ways that are more personalized, in ways that are more individually felt. We were able to tell the story of Meta Fuller, who in 1919 sculpts this piece here. It's called A Silent Protest, where she reacts to the horrible lynching of a woman named Mary Turner in the South, who's actually lynched while she's 8 months pregnant, and the baby was killed during the lynching as well. And she hears about this horrific story, and she's not a woman who often made political art, but this was the one exception. She wanted to devote some of her craft towards telling the story, towards speaking out. She calls it a silent protest to really underscore the ways that even one individual can really take a stand against what's happening in the country. And then finally, with the advent of organizations like the NAACP, we now have the capacity for generations of leadership to take on this fight, to continue pushing towards the full realization of those citizenship rights. And what's interesting is this photo of children from 1918. These are going to be the adults who eventually carry out the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, that it's this lineage, this legacy of pushing for full citizenship, for holding the United States to the promise of the Reconstruction Amendments. Even though we're in the time period of Jim Crow, this legacy pushes forward. In the exhibition, we took our visitors through a little taste of what happens between the end of our exhibition in 1918 and towards the civil rights movement, as a way of understanding how this time period sets the scene for the full reception of rights and citizenship that takes place in the years to come. Now, the exhibition ended there in 1918 and left our museum in 2019, but it's had a life since then. We've actually been able to convert the exhibition into a poster exhibition where it's just images and anyone can download them, print them, and display them. And we've been able to offer this exhibition as a digital download to institutions, to individuals, to anyone who chooses to display it. And we've actually had a tremendous response of more than 200 institutions who have emailed us and asked for these downloads to be able to display from more than 29 states. And so we really see this exhibition as continuing that legacy and continuing that conversation of the importance of Black citizenship, the importance for all American people to really of America at its first and second founding. So I want to welcome Marci back. We're going to take some of your questions now and get to hear a little bit more of your thoughts for this exhibition.
Hi, Dominique. Thank you so much. That was it made me nostalgic, just as you were saying earlier. It's
Me too.
to see all of that again. This was a favorite exhibition for many of us who worked on it.
Yeah.
One thing to note before we open up with questions is that in addition to the posters, which as Dominique was saying, have really had a wonderful life, the exhibit has also been on the road ever since it closed at New York Historical in 2019. So it first traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, then Birmingham, Alabama, then Atlanta, Georgia. It's still in Atlanta, and we were happy to learn that the museum there, the Atlanta History Center, is just about to open up after having been closed because of the pandemic. So the show has been extended, will be there for some months still. And then in 2021, it will go to Austin, Texas, to the Bullock Museum of Texas. So it's really had a wonderful life. It's been a really popular show, and it means that many thousands of people around the country have been exposed to this version of the story, either through the posters or the traveling show or our show. So we have some wonderful questions here, Dominique. So I'm going to try to field them and ask you your thoughts on them. Maybe just to pick one, which is sort of the more positive part of the story. One person asked, to what extent did the Reconstruction Amendments impact Black civil rights in the North? So not the South, but the North.
That's an excellent question, and one we thought a lot about when we were putting this together. Of course, you did have many African Americans at the time of the Civil War who were already free. Many northern states had abolished slavery many years earlier than the Civil War. What you had was this kind of piecemeal right to vote kind of throughout the North. You had some states that had property restrictions, others that didn't. You had kind of these lengthy registration processes in some areas. And so what the Reconstruction Amendments do is really set a standard, set a national standard that every African-American man at the time has the right to vote without a property restriction, without a how long you've lived in the area restriction. It really kind of sets as a baseline this right to vote, this right of full citizenship that in some cases was disputed in the North. Even though slavery had ended, you still didn't have this kind of blanket extension of citizenship and voting rights before then. And so it kind of establishes that national standard.
Thank you. So here's another question about voting rights, but this is the negative aspect of the story. So this question is, how is it that women actually could not be included into the 15th Amendment? How was it that women could be considered citizens but not have the right to vote?
Well, it's certainly, I guess the first thing to say, it was not for lack of trying. In this time period, during Reconstruction, as I mentioned, it was seen like there was an opening, right? That the doors were opening, and that if you could get in during this time period, that you would be able to receive full citizenship rights. And so many, including recognizable names like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony, were pushing hard for these Reconstruction Amendments to include women. And there were a number of reasons that didn't happen. Many men just thought that women were incapable of voting. There was the thought that it would overwhelm the voting polls, and that there would just be too many people voting. They would just vote along with their husbands. Our colleagues at the Center for Women's History actually just opened a show before our museum unfortunately closed. For the time being, that explored a little bit of this long journey towards suffrage for women. But even noted abolitionists like Frederick Douglass had supported women's right to vote before Reconstruction, and kind of wavered at the time, that it was thought of maybe not too much too fast, maybe just Black men, and then we can get to women later. And so there was kind of this little bit of foot dragging that happened during Reconstruction.
And maybe just to add to that, the notion of citizenship has been an evolving one. And so all citizens have not always had the same kinds of rights and privileges and responsibilities. So that's one of the reasons that we've continued to think it's really such a critical topic for us to continue to devote programs, both historical exhibits and public programs, to maybe one of the key questions for our society. Maybe just to continue the woman theme for a moment, I don't know the answer to this, maybe you do. Were women part of the KKK, formally, I suppose?
So yes, well, I guess sometimes. So the early iteration of the KKK that we raised in the exhibition was mostly men. It was mostly this kind of vigilante violence carried out by men. But when the Klan reorganizes in the 20th century, becomes more national, becomes more centralized, women play an important part in establishing the KKK and carrying out its mission. They were known as the Camellias with a K, and they were an important kind of branch of the Ku Klux Klan in creating not just terror and violence, but also political will, that they were running the schools, running the kind of events and the carnivals and things like that, that really drew a larger population to the Klan.
Okay, thank you. The keeping with the Klan just for a moment, this participant would like to know whether the Klan was active in the North during this time. So I'm assuming they're talking about Reconstruction and I guess during our time period, not the 1920s.
There's some documentation of the Klan happening in the North, especially in kind of some in New Jersey, some in Pennsylvania. But the Klan in the late 19th century is just one of a number of vigilante groups that were aimed at preventing Black voting and Black office holding. And so while you had the Klan in the North, you also had these smaller and more localized groups that were joining them in carrying out this vigilante violence. So there was the Klan, but there were also plenty of people who had a similar goal as the Klan did.
I'm going to sneak in, well, no, maybe I won't sneak in a question. I'll wait for a moment. There's a couple of interesting questions here about, there's one about Black elected officials in the 1870s. Do you know whether many of this group of men who began to take public office, and of course the public office could have ranged from sheriff, a municipal leader to a legislative leader. Do you know whether many of these people, or even most of them, had once been enslaved, or were some of these people had some of them been freed earlier?
Absolutely. Quite a number of them had been formerly enslaved, including probably most notably South Carolina Representative Robert Smalls, who had freed himself. He was enslaved and kind of forced to assist the Confederacy in fighting against the Union, and stole a battleship and sailed it to the North and therefore freed himself. So not only did some of them, make that journey from being property in the eyes of the law to being, congressional representatives, but they kind of went through that process of freeing themselves, really seizing freedom, seizing that citizenship, and not just kind of waiting for it to be granted to them.
And that's actually one of the themes that we worked so hard to thread really throughout the show, is that both the process of creating freedom, of learning what that meant, making that real, and then the process of struggling for it when it was being attacked, was an evolving, ongoing process. And it really mattered what everybody did. Everybody's actions mattered. It was kind of history in the making.
Right, which helped kind of in the sense of, obviously only Black men could run for office, but there were so many ways that Black women participated in that process of even political power. They were helping to run campaigns. They were encouraging people to register to vote. There were so many ways that even without voting, you could be trying to get that political power together. So there was a role for everyone.
And I remember actually during the process of working on it, one of our great advisors, Michelle Mitchell from NYU, kept saying to us every time we came up with an outline, where are the women? I think the women belong here. I think there needs to be more places for more women here to try to get those stories out, which hadn't been raised in public as much. Yeah. So that the role of our advisors in each of our exhibits is really incredible. We do lots of our own reading and we have our own training, but without their expertise coming in, we're really at sea, or we just don't know the key points to bring up. Yeah. There's another question here about this topic of military service and citizenship and resistance. The question is, well, was it the experiences of African-American soldiers returning from World War I that contributed to the early efforts against Jim Crow? Or what was the role of the returning soldier?
Sure, that's actually, I mentioned that we ended our exhibition right kind of in the early 20th century, in 1918, 1919, basically the end of World War I. And that's in part because that idea and that symbol of the returning soldier was such a crucial one for the legacy and the kind of goings on of Jim Crow. On the one hand, so many of those soldiers come back from Europe saying, you know, I fought just as hard as anyone else. I helped, you know, I campaigned for America the same way anyone else did. How dare I come back to a country that doesn't recognize my full rights? And on the other hand, this image of these Black soldiers coming back in full uniform, looking regal, looking so worthy of that citizenship, you know, having made that visible sacrifice and step for American democracy, it incensed a lot of people who didn't believe in Black citizenship. And what's called the Red Summer of 1919, where you had this, this complete rash of racial violence that takes over the country, a lot of the kind of catalyzing moments of those race riots were Black men in uniform returning back from World War I, being the targets of racial violence, whether that's lynching, whether that's violence to their homes or to their families. It was very clear that that symbol of a returning soldier in uniform, who was an African-American man, was, it felt for some as such an important part of showing citizenship. And for those who wanted it, this was their rationale, this was their proof. And for those who didn't want it, this was, you know, unacceptable.
I had wanted to sneak in a couple of questions as well. You know, one of the amazing things about doing these projects, and we've experienced it time and time again, is how much we learn in the process.
Oh, yes.
It's really an incredible benefit and privilege. So I'm wondering if you might share, you know, what really surprised you? You knew something about this history going in, but what were some of the things you discovered that really surprised you?
I think a major one for me, and I mentioned it a little bit during our Priorities of Freedom section, was the importance of the Sea Islands off the coast of the Carolinas and off the coast of Georgia, that they're now a national monument to Reconstruction. It's one of the last things that President Obama did while in office, was establish some of those lands as a national monument to Reconstruction where there hadn't been one before. And that's because those Sea Islands were such an incredible place where this project of establishing Black citizenship took place. So I mentioned that residents of the Sea Island were given confiscated Confederate land to farm, and it was eventually taken back, but they kind of did get to embark on that project of self-sufficient farming. The Penn School that I mentioned that was established on the Sea Islands was such an important place for African-American education and agriculture, and still exists as a kind of public site today. Robert Smalls, who is the man who went from freeing himself in slavery, stealing the battleship, all the way to Congress, was born in the Sea Islands. And not only is this an important place, but it carries such a unique African-American culture. This is where the Gullah and Geechee people originate from, who have their own language, their own food traditions, their own dance and music traditions. It's a uniquely American culture that really exists in one place and is such an important place in the story of Reconstruction that I hadn't learned about in school, but is such a clear representation of both the uniqueness and the vibrancy of African-American culture, and also the importance of Reconstruction and how much promise there was that was then rolled back. Right. I don't know if you have one, Marci, something you learned.
I do, but we actually need to wrap up. So we'll have to save that for next time. So everybody, we've unfortunately run out of time. Thank you so much for your participation. And for your exceptional support of New York Historical. So we look forward to seeing you back here a week from tonight for the next episode of Curator Confidential. It's called Jewish Exclusion, Identity, and the McKim, Mead, and White Architectural Collection, with our great colleague, Marilyn Krishner, PhD, New York Historical's curator and head of the Department of Prints, Photographs, and Architectural Collections. And Marilyn will be joined by guest curator Horatio Joyce, PhD, the Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Research Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we hope we see you next Tuesday, and until then, thank you very much and good night.
Thanks so much.